Julian Carver's keycard beeped against the lock of Unit 1804 at precisely 5:22 in the morning. The hallway light came on automatically, cold, indifferent, the way it always did when no one had moved through the apartment in hours. He stepped inside. His dress shirt was untucked, his jacket folded over one arm, and somewhere beneath the scent of his own cologne was something else. Something floral, something that didn't belong to his wife. He told himself, the way he always did, that it didn't matter. What mattered was that the apartment was wrong. Julian stood in the entryway and listened. The twins were 7 weeks old. By this hour, the living room should have held the sound of at least one of them. The small, fretful crying that he had grown very good at sleeping through. Annette would be on the couch with them, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in whatever elastic she'd grabbed off the bathroom counter. She would look up when he came in, and he would say something about the time, and she would say nothing back. That was the routine. That was what he'd grown used to. But tonight there was no crying, no humming, no sound of a woman rocking two small lives back and forth in the dark. "Annette," he called. Nothing. He moved through the living room. The double bassinet that had sat against the window for the past 7 weeks was gone. Not pushed to the side, not folded up in the corner. Gone. The shelf above it, which Annette had arranged with cloth diapers and a small jar of cream and a photograph of her mother, taken in Fredericton the summer before she passed, was bare. Even the faint smell of baby powder that had worked its way into every room was absent, as though someone had scrubbed it out while he was away. Julian's chest tightened in a way he didn't immediately recognize as fear. He checked the bedroom. Her side of the closet was closed. He opened it. The clothes that hung there were the ones she never touched. The dresses she'd worn to his firm's events, the blazer she'd bought for her job interview at Vancouver General 5 years ago. Everything she wore daily was missing. He stood there counting empty hangers before he understood what he was counting. Back in the kitchen, on the island where she always left his coffee mug rinsed and turned upside down, there were 2 things, a folded piece of paper and a USB drive. He opened the note with hands that had started, without permission, to shake. "Julian, by the time you read this, we are already gone. I know everything. Not just what I suspected, but everything. Don't look for us. My lawyer will contact yours. Annette." He read it twice, then a third time. Then he picked up the USB drive and stood holding it, not moving, for a long moment while the morning light began to slide through the floor-to-ceiling windows and lay itself across the hardwood floors of the home he'd made sure was registered only in his name. He thought, "She has nowhere to go, no money of her own, no family left in the city. I made sure of that, one small decision at a time." And then, standing in the kitchen of his empty penthouse, while the city of Vancouver woke up beneath him, Julian Carver realized something that rearranged every assumption he'd built his life on. Annette had not left in desperation. She had left with a plan. Annette Belmore had arrived in Vancouver on a Tuesday in October, 3 years before any of this happened, with 2 checked bags and a job offer from Vancouver General Hospital, printed and folded in her jacket pocket. She had grown up in New Brunswick, trained in Halifax, and spent 4 years in the pediatric unit at the QEII Health Sciences Center before a recruiter reached out about a senior nurse practitioner role on the coast. She'd said yes because she was 33 and ready for something different, and because the mountains in the photographs looked like nothing she'd ever lived near. She had not expected Julian. They met at a fundraising dinner for the hospital foundation. He was the kind of man who wore a watch that cost more than her monthly rent and still managed to seem like he wasn't trying. He asked about her work, actually asked, leaning slightly forward, making eye contact that didn't waver. And when she described a case that had kept her awake for a week, he didn't look for the exit. He listened. She remembered thinking, "This one is different." They were married 11 months later. Small ceremony. A borrowed venue in Gastown. Annette wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and felt, for the first time in a long time, like the future was something solid she could put her weight on. The condo in Cole Harbor felt like a dream she hadn't quite earned. Julian walked her through it the day they got the keys, pointing out the views as though he was proud of himself and proud of her at the same time, saying, "This is ours, Annie. Fresh start." She believed him. She was looking at the mountains and not at the paperwork he'd filed, which listed only one name on the ownership documents. The first fracture was quiet. She missed a colleague's retirement dinner because a patient, a 4-year-old boy with a respiratory infection that had turned complicated, needed her to stay past shift. Julian was already at the restaurant when she called. He didn't say much on the phone, but when she came home that night, he was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine he'd barely touched, and his voice, when he spoke, was the specific kind of calm that was worse than anger. "You made me look like I came alone," he said. She had been saving a child's airway. She apologized anyway. That was how it started. When she found out she was pregnant, she told him standing in their kitchen on a Saturday morning, the test still in her hand, half laughing because she didn't know what else to do. He hugged her. His arms went around her the right way, but his smile, when she pulled back to look at him, didn't reach his eyes. "We'll make it work," he said, and the word work landed wrong. Like a problem to be managed, not a life to be welcomed. Still, for a while, he tried. He drove her to appointments. He read whatever she left on the nightstand. He bought 2 sets of tiny matching sleepers, pale yellow, one for each, when the ultrasound confirmed twins, and he set them on the shelf in what would become the nursery. Annette kept them there and touched them sometimes when she walked past, trying to hold on to that version of him. But as the months went on, Julian grew distant. He began staying late at the office, first twice a week, then 4 nights, then 5. He came home past midnight and went straight to the shower. He stopped asking about her appointments. He stopped touching the growing movement under her skin when the babies kicked. His phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter, was suddenly always turned over, always on silent, always carried out of the room when it buzzed. Annette told herself marriages had difficult seasons. She told herself stress was a real thing. She told herself the babies would change everything. She noticed Naomi Lee for the first time at the firm's annual winter gala at the Fairmont Pacific Rim. Julian had insisted she come. "It's good for us to be seen together," he'd said, adjusting his cufflinks without looking at her. She was 35 weeks pregnant and had spent the previous night awake, with back pain so steady it felt like a second heartbeat. She wore the one formal dress that still fit, navy blue and simple, and she stood near the edge of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water while Julian moved through the crowd in a way he never moved through their apartment anymore, easy, alive, purposeful. Then she saw the woman her husband became when Naomi Lee walked into the room. Lee was somewhere in her early 30s, dark hair cut precisely at the shoulder, a deep green dress. She carried herself like someone who had never been unsure of her right to take up space. When Julian spotted her from across the room, something shifted in his posture, a straightening, a brightening, that Annette recognized as the person she had married, the person who had disappeared. He crossed the room to Lee before Annette had finished processing what she was watching. They stood close together. He said something. She laughed, her hand briefly touching his arm. Then he placed his hand on the small of her back, familiar and unhurried, the gesture of a man who had done it many times before. Annette set her glass down carefully. She walked to the coat check alone, retrieved her jacket, and stepped out into the December rain on Cordova Street. She stood there on the sidewalk for a long time, her hands on her belly, the cold air doing nothing to clear the particular kind of clarity that had settled over her. A photographer inside would later capture a photo of Julian and Naomi from that evening. She would find it months later, in a folder she was never meant to open. That photograph would be the first piece of evidence on the USB that ended Julian's life as he had arranged it. The nights that followed the gala were quiet in the way that things are quiet before they break. Annette went to work. She came home. She cooked dinners Julian ate in front of his laptop without commenting on them. She lay awake in the dark, listening to him breathe, and knowing, the way you sometimes know things that your brain hasn't finished processing yet, that something was already over. She found the receipt 6 weeks later, in the chest pocket of a shirt she was taking to the cleaners. A dinner for 2 at Hawksworth Restaurant, $438. Dated the same night he'd texted her. Running behind, don't wait up, big pitch tomorrow. Her hands didn't shake when she found it. That surprised her. She folded it back the way she'd found it and put it in the ceramic bowl she kept on the shelf in her closet, behind a pair of shoes she never wore. She had started being careful, without quite deciding to be. The twins were born at 37 weeks on a Thursday in February, in the early hours before dawn. Annette had gone into labor alone. Julian hadn't answered his phone, not the first time she called, not the third, not the sixth. She had dialed 911 herself and ridden to BC Women's Hospital in an ambulance with a paramedic who asked if her husband was on his way. She said yes. She didn't know if she was lying. A boy and a girl, both small, both needing oxygen in the first hours, both utterly perfect in the way that premature babies are, like something the world wasn't quite ready for. Annette lay in the hospital bed holding one in each arm and whispering to them, while machines monitored their breathing, and nurses checked in every 20 minutes, and she felt, beneath the exhaustion and the relief, a grief she didn't have a name for yet. Julian arrived at 11 the next morning, hair uncombed, collar wrinkled. The particular smell of someone else's perfume that he clearly didn't know she had learned to identify from 6 feet away. His first words were, "Why didn't you call me sooner? You scared me, Annette." Something inside her went very still. The weeks after the birth were a fog that never fully lifted. The twins came home after 9 days in the NICU, and Julian came home after 9 that evening on the first night, and the gap between those two facts said everything. He was present in the way that a piece of furniture is present, occupying space, occasionally noticed, contributing nothing to the actual work of the room. Night feedings happened without him. Pediatrician appointments happened without him. The particular terror of watching two small people breathe in the dark at 3 a.m., checking and rechecking, because the fear doesn't switch off just because you've gotten through the previous night. That happened without him. Annette told him once, at 2 in the morning when she was running on 90 minutes of sleep, and couldn't locate the part of herself that was supposed to keep quiet. "I think something is wrong with me. I can't feel the ground." He was reading something on his laptop. He didn't look up. "You're just tired," he said. "You've always been prone to over-dramatizing things." She stood in the doorway of his office for a moment after he said it, holding their daughter against her chest, and then she walked back down the hall to the twins' room and sat in the rocking chair and cried as quietly as she knew how. She had been a nurse for 11 years. She knew what postpartum depression looked like from the outside. She had sat with other women through it. And she had just been told, by the person who was supposed to be her partner in this, that she was over-dramatizing. It was 2 weeks after that when she opened Julian's laptop. She hadn't meant to snoop. She genuinely hadn't. She'd been looking for the power cord. Hers had stopped working, and she needed to print a form for the twins' health records before their next appointment. Julian had left his laptop open on the kitchen island, something he never did. The screen was still lit. A message notification sat in the corner. From Naomi Lee. Annette's finger moved before she made a decision. The message thread was long, months of it. Photographs, restaurants she'd never been taken to, weekend trips she'd been told were client meetings, a hotel suite in Whistler on the long weekend she'd spent alone in the condo, with her feet swollen and her back aching, and Julian's voice on the phone saying the client had extended the retreat. She scrolled until her hands were shaking so badly she had to set the laptop on the counter. Then she saw the folder. It was titled AC, Legal Review. She opened it. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a post-nuptial amendment that she had been asked to sign 14 months ago, presented to her as a routine update to their tax filing status, which she had signed because she'd just come off a 12-hour shift and trusted the man she had married. The second document was the true version of what she'd signed. It removed her right to the matrimonial home. It capped any spousal support she could claim. It designated Julian as the primary financial guardian of any children born during the marriage. The third document was titled Custody Framework, Preliminary. He had been building a case against her since before the twins were born. Annette closed the laptop. She walked to the window and stood looking at the lights of the North Shore reflected in the water of the inlet, and she breathed, slow and deliberate, the way she breathed in triage when the noise got so loud she couldn't hear herself think. Then she walked to the twins' room, sat down on the floor between their 2 bassinets, and listened to them breathe. "I'm going to fix this," she said quietly, to the room, to herself, to the two people who had no idea what surrounded them. "I promise you I'm going to fix this." She met Thomas Obi 3 days later in the corridor outside the pediatric outpatient clinic at Vancouver General. She almost didn't recognize him. He had aged well, leaner face, a little gray at the temples, but the careful way he moved, slightly favoring his left side, brought it back. A motor vehicle collision on the Granville Bridge, 4 winters ago. She'd been ending a shift when the paramedics brought him in. She'd stayed an extra 2 hours, monitoring him through a breathing crisis, talking to him the whole time, because unconscious or not, she believed people heard you. When he was discharged, he'd sent flowers to the unit. She hadn't thought about him since. He recognized her first. "Annette Belmore," he said, and she registered, with a small internal jolt, that he'd used her maiden name, the one she'd been born with, not the one she'd taken on 11 months after arriving in Vancouver. "You probably don't remember me." She did. He was a family law attorney now, he explained. Pro bono work, mostly. Women who needed legal help and had no access to it. He had heard her name that morning from a colleague in the hospital administration office, someone who'd flagged a patient file. He had taken a chance and waited. "I heard your name and I remembered what you did for me," he said. "And I thought, if she's in the kind of trouble I think she might be in, she deserves someone in her corner." Annette looked at him for a long moment. A nurse she knew by name walked past and nodded. The corridor smelled of floor wax and antiseptic and the slightly stale air of a building that held too much of the city's grief. "Can we talk somewhere?" she said. In a small consultation room near the end of the hallway, she told him everything: the documents, the photographs, the postpartum dismissal, the custody framework, the 14 months of careful, premeditated dismantling of anything that belonged to her. Thomas listened with a legal pad open in front of him, writing in handwriting so small she couldn't read it from across the table. He didn't interrupt, he didn't visibly react. He waited until she had run out of words. "He's been planning this longer than you know," Thomas said. "The prenuptial amendment alone would have been enough to take the condo, the joint accounts, and potentially primary custody. But there's something important here." He tapped his pen against the pad. "He hasn't done it yet, which means there's still time." He outlined what she needed to do. Document everything. Photographs, screenshots, the receipt from Hawksworth, dates, times, locations. Open a separate account at a bank Julian didn't use. Move small amounts of cash, slowly over several weeks, nothing that would register as unusual on their shared account. Photograph the legal documents she'd found and upload them to an encrypted drive. Prepare a go bag. The twins' medical records, birth certificates, her nursing license, her passport. Enough supplies for 72 hours. "And you need to tell someone at the hospital," Thomas said. "Someone who's seen the signs. Someone who can testify, if it comes to that, about the postpartum situation." Annette already knew who he meant before he said the name. Dr. Ruth Sinclair had been the chief of family medicine at VGH for 9 years. She was 61, sharp in the way of someone who had spent decades in a system that required you to be. She had mentored Annette through her first year at the hospital, and she was the person who had quietly placed a box of tissues on the break room table. 3 weeks after the twins came home, when Annette had sat down to eat lunch, and instead stared at her sandwich for 20 minutes without moving. "You don't have to carry all of this," Sinclair told her, when Annette finally sat across from her and told her the truth. "That's what they count on, you know, that you'll be too exhausted, too isolated, too worried about looking unstable to tell anyone." Annette asked, "Did you ever?" "Yes," Sinclair said before the question finished. "Different circumstances, same architecture." She opened her desk drawer and removed a folder she'd had prepared. "I started putting this together the week I noticed you weren't eating your lunch." Annette stared at it. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Sinclair said gently. "Now let's make sure we move faster than he does." The preparations took 3 weeks. Annette sorted them in pieces too small to be noticed. 3 onesies moved from the twins' drawer to her work bag one Tuesday. A can of formula placed behind the laundry basket on a Wednesday. Important documents photographed and uploaded at 2 a.m. while Julian slept. She opened an account at a credit union on West Broadway and made 3 small deposits. Cash from her own pay, amounts she'd been setting aside for months. She texted Thomas in a coded shorthand they'd agreed on. She was careful. She was methodical. She had spent 11 years learning to stay functional under pressure, and she used every part of that training now. Then, 9 days before she planned to leave, Julian found the bag. He came home late on a Sunday, unusual. He generally preferred to disappear on weeknights, when her work schedule gave him cover. He'd been drinking, not obviously but enough that his eyes were slightly unfocused, and his questions had a sharpened edge they didn't always have. He stood in the doorway of the twins' room while she was doing a feeding and watched her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You've seemed different lately," he said. She didn't look up. "I'm tired." "No," he said, "something else." She kept her face still. She had been practicing this for weeks, keeping her face still when her heart was doing something very different. 3 days later, he went into the hallway closet, looking for a squash racket he hadn't touched since November, and found the extra can of formula she'd moved there. He brought it to the kitchen and set it on the counter without speaking, and looked at her. "I've been stockpiling," she said before he could ask. "The pharmacies have been running low. I read a thing online." She shrugged with a casualness she manufactured from nothing. "I'd rather have too much than not enough." He held her gaze for 5 full seconds. She counted. Then he put the can back on the counter and walked away. That night, after he was asleep, Annette sat in the twins' room with her back against the wall and her phone in her lap and texted Thomas one word: "Tomorrow." His reply came in under a minute. "Confirmed. 7 a.m. black SUV 1 block north on Cardero. Yvonne will be driving. Don't be late." She didn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair between the 2 bassinets and watched her children breathe, and made them a promise she intended to keep for the rest of her life. At 6:40 the next morning, Julian came out of the bedroom in a suit, checked his phone twice, poured himself a coffee he barely touched, and picked up his briefcase. He paused at the door and looked at her. She was on the couch, nursing one twin, the other asleep against her shoulder, everything arranged the way it always was. "Don't let the place get away from you today," he said. "Have a good day," she said. The door closed. She counted to 15, then she moved. In 4 minutes and 40 seconds, she had the go-bag over one shoulder, the twins in their carrier and stroller respectively, the envelope of documents tucked inside the diaper bag, and the apartment door open. The hallway was empty. The elevator took 20 seconds. The lobby concierge looked up and smiled. "Morning, Mrs. Carver. Those 2 are growing fast." And she smiled back and said she was heading to the park while the weather held, which was plausible, which was what she had planned to say. She pushed the stroller north on Cardero. The February air was sharp but dry. The mountains were visible above the buildings, white-peaked and enormous, indifferent to everything happening below them. 1 block north, the black SUV was parked against the curb with its engine running. The passenger window came down. Annette, a woman's voice, warm, direct, unhurried. "Yes." "I'm Yvonne Marsh. Get in, we've got time." Annette lifted her son from the carrier, settled both children into the back seat with her, and pulled the door closed. The city moved past the windows. Burrard Inlet, the bridge, the highway opening up to the east. She didn't look back. Julian came home that evening to an apartment that was wrong in the same particular way it had been wrong. At 5:22 that morning, 6 months and 11 days later, when the judge read the final custody order in a courtroom in downtown Vancouver. He found the USB drive and the note, and he thought, "She has nowhere to go." He was wrong about that. He had been wrong about most things, it turned out, but he had been most wrong about that. Annette had gone to Edmonton, to a private residence run through a foundation. Yvonne Marsh had spent a decade building a network of quiet, secure houses that were not listed anywhere, connected by a roster of women who understood exactly what it meant to need a door that locked from the inside. She found work within a month, consulting remotely for a pediatric telehealth startup that served rural Alberta communities. The twins grew. She slept. She rebuilt slowly, the way you rebuild anything after a long time of having almost nothing to work with. One day at a time, in the order that mattered most. Thomas filed the restraining order. He filed the custody petition. He organized the evidence. Every photograph, every timestamp, the legal documents, the medical record of what Annette had experienced alone in the hospital in February, the testimony of Dr. Ruth Sinclair, who had kept her own careful notes over 4 months, into a case so thorough it required almost no argument to present. The facts arranged themselves. Julian hired 3 different private investigators over 8 months. None of them found her. The court appearance was 18 months after she left. Annette drove down to Vancouver alone, leaving the twins with Yvonne, and sat beside Thomas in a courtroom with tall windows and morning light and the particular charged air of a room where things are about to be decided permanently. Julian sat across the aisle. He was thinner. The confidence he'd always worn like a second suit was still there, but it fit differently now, like something he was trying to hold closed over a wound. When the ruling came, it came clearly. Full physical and legal custody to Annette. Substantial child support, backdated to the month she'd left. Restitution for the post-nuptial fraud. Supervised visitation for Julian, conditional on a parenting course and a psychological assessment. Julian stood as the judge finished. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. Julian looked across the room at Annette. He said her name, not with anger, not anymore, just with the sound of someone who finally understood what they had done, which was too late to be useful to anyone. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say that the court had already said more clearly and more permanently than she ever could. Outside on the courthouse steps, the February sun was doing its best against a cold Vancouver sky. Thomas shook her hand and then after a moment hugged her briefly, professional instinct briefly overridden by something more human. She thanked him. She meant it in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She called Yvonne from the car. Heard her daughter shout something in the background. Heard her son laugh at whatever it was. She had stopped being afraid somewhere between Edmonton and now. She couldn't name the exact day it happened. Somewhere in the ordinary middle of things. A morning with coffee going cold while she read files. An evening with 2 small people pulling themselves upright against the coffee table. An afternoon walk when she noticed she had not checked the window once to see if anyone was watching. It left quietly. That was the thing about fear when it finally went. It didn't make an announcement. She drove back to Edmonton in the afternoon into the wide-open Alberta sky, and the road ahead was long and unremarkable and completely hers.